Rygar is an action game with RPG elements for the NES that is one of several standout side-scrolling adventure games on the console. You play as a hero that's been stirred awake from death's embrace by the prayers of people hoping for a savior. Ligar and his cruel armies brought about destruction and despair to the people of the world of Argul, and after establishing his reign of evil, Ligar also closed the door to peace to crush the last remaining spirit out of his new kingdom. As far as backstories go, I thought that this one was pretty fantastic. It's not every day that you get to take up the role of a zombie warrior that's returned to the land of the living for one last whack at evil. It was a refreshing change from the more popular prophecies that tell the coming-of-age tales of destiny-ensnared children that are just taking up a sword for the first time. In Rygar, there are two main game modes. There's a top-down view where you traverse the region of Garlos via a quiet overworld that links up the different areas you'll visit, and side-scrolling stages where you'll engage in intensive combat on the search for the imprisoned Endora gods. I really enjoyed how cozy the overworld felt. You don't have to walk through screen after screen of blocked paths brimming with things trying to kill you at every turn. Garlos is actually quite small, and there were only a handful of enemies to face here. The toughest part of travel in these sections extends to something beyond the potential to lose your way or the monsters themselves, and it's actually these pulley systems used to get across chasms. When I initially approached the lines, I tried what felt like every logical position to latch onto the rope and still failed to do so. The place that you have to stand is extremely specific, and it never felt like I got the hang of this during my entire playtime. I had a couple of unfortunate mishaps where I got too close to the cliffs and tumbled down to instant death, but at least when you finally do attach, the game gives you some good feedback. There's a visual change in your sprite and an audio cue, and after that, you just have to use the D-pad to move across. Since you're forced to use these contraptions often, a more forgiving way to clip on that didn't usually end in death would have been nice. I was really grateful for the detailed map that was provided in the manual, and I can't imagine playing Rygar without it. Not only did it accurately portray where different locations were laid out, but it also revealed where each of the major game's items were hidden. I expect that some people might feel that this is a little too guided and might prefer the approach of bumping into the next tool by exploring without this resource. The map is by no means necessary. I chose to consult this often because even though it might tell you where each of the sacred treasures are found, it doesn't tell you how to find them or which other tools you might need to reach the part of the stage where they're stashed. You will undoubtedly run into roadblocks that require a special item to bypass, and you won't really know what you need until you get there to see for yourself. Speaking with NPCs in caves in the side-scrolling stages will also provide some helpful clues, so there's still a ton of trial and error for a first-time playthrough even with the item locations in mind. I got through the whole game without any help in a couple of hours my first time playing. As long as you're noting down what people tell you and keep a list of item requiring obstacles in each stage to come back to later, you shouldn't have much of a problem progressing through this one with a little bit of common sense. If the overworld seems a bit drab, you'll be glad to know that the world is much expanded upon in the side-scrolling areas. There was a ton of variety in level design, and when you walked through a door on the overworld, you never knew if you were in for several back-to-back connecting segments of beautiful mountains and forests, or just a couple of screens leading up through a building to a boss fight. The graphics in this game's world really stood out to me, and even the characters you run into really appreciate the scenery. I'd even go so far as to say that these environments rival my love of the gorgeous backdrops in Castlevania II: Simon's Quest. In terms of their scope and detail, I've rarely seen such thoughtful use of backgrounds in these kinds of action games. On the other hand, the music was unfortunately hit and miss, but I did like the soundtrack overall. Many of the main areas had proud and triumphant themes for our hero, but then there was stuff like the 4-note tune in the palace level. Rygar's soundtrack is nowhere near my personal favorite, but it did a good enough job for what it was. There are lots of interesting enemies to throw down with, and the manual names them animalized men wriggling eerily. Besides being hilarious, this title doesn't make sense in the context of the plot. There's no mention of the people of Argul being transformed into humanoid animals anywhere in the backstory, so unless these were Ligar's army members, I have no idea where any of this comes from. Anyway, as you might expect, monsters come in all varieties, and the only weapon that you have is the disc armor. It has pretty good range, but it can only shoot from side to side in the side-scrolling sections. Many foes come at you from above or below, which might seem like a problem at first, but Rygar's jump is very high and adaptable mid-air, giving you a ton of control to line up attacks. The only time I seemed to get into trouble was when I was trying to duck down an attack with the disc armor in a handful of places. Once you have the grapple item, you're able to pop down below some platforms. It's great when you're exploring around, but if you do this by accident in the throes of battle, you'll wind up vulnerable to enemy assaults while you're frantically trying to climb back up. The bigger sticking point was the enemy spawn rate. It's a never-ending supply of fiend after fiend popping into existence right in front of you, below you, or on top of you. Even at the very start of the game, when you've barely had a moment to breathe some fresh air into your rotting zombie lungs, you're being bombarded. Their numbers alone were exhausting, but in tough situations, you can opt to avoid them altogether or hop on them to stun them for a few moments. The monster AI was fast and furious, but one enemy type called Epilcons was especially bothersome. First of all, what am I even looking at here? These look like a shrunken down lipstick-wearing version of these big boss enemies from Faxanadu, but with more random appendages glued onto the back of them. They're supposed to be egg bombers, but they have terrible aim. The real issue with them is their size. If there's more than one of them on screen, they can stack up into a huge conglomerate, and there's no way that you're getting out of that predicament untouched. Despite feeling swamped with the sheer number of things that I had to kill on the regular, I really enjoyed the different creatures in this game's world. Getting steamrolled by giant rolfers in dark caverns or getting hugged by the adorable mongolins in the skies were a part of the sense of awe and discovery in the land of Argul. The best part about combat is the experience system. Constantly having to kill foes while exploring the side-scrolling stages was not in vain and directly increased a handful of confusingly named stats on the status screen. Tone is easy enough to figure out because as you increase how jacked Rygar is, his attack strength also increases. The stat called last is a bit confusing, but it's supposed to govern defense and health meter length, but I'm not sure at which increments any stats are improved. You do start to notice that enemies are taking less hits to kill and that your life meter is growing, so there's a nice feeling of progress despite a complete lack of weapon and armor upgrades or much of an inventory to speak of. Rygar has one life bar to live, and when it runs out, you're presented with a game over. It seems harsh, but it's also kind of a lie because you're able to continue right from where you left off indefinitely. You restart at the beginning of the area you were in when you bit the dust, and you get to keep all of your experience. You also hang on to all of the quest-related items that you found up until that point, and the only consequence from dying is losing mind points. These can be used to cast a couple of spells, but I never ended up using them at all. They're handy, but I had no idea that they existed until after I beat the game. The mind points are easy enough to replenish since the star icons that you collect to raise spirit points for spellcasting randomly drop from enemies along with health refills. I thought this system worked perfectly, and I appreciated the leniency as someone who got smoked at least 100 times throughout my playthrough. I mistimed jumps, misstepped onto graphics that I thought were part of the foreground instead of the background, succumbed at the hands of several bosses, and also died from transitioning between screens without using a rope to showcase a few. If I'd been bogged down trying to repeat lost progress, my time with Rygar would have been much longer, but also significantly more discouraging. For much of the adventure, I felt over-leveled. Because of all the dying I just mentioned, I had to walk through stages a lot and destroyed way more enemies than other people might during a well-practiced playthrough. I understand that the PAL version of the game caps the upper limits for character stats at a much lower value than the NTSC version, making the game a lot harder since you can't grind up as much to get ripped with ultimate tone. While I haven't experienced this firsthand, I imagine embedded difficulty that you can't overcome might make Rygar feel a lot less manageable for people in those regions. Speaking from my own experience as an NTSC player, raking in the stats made boss encounters painless, with some of them falling to my disc armor in only a couple of hits. While many of them were two-headed abominations that were mostly unremarkable, I did like the variety in some of the battle patterns. A few of them unfortunately did nothing more than walk menacingly in one direction towards me, while others forced me to use items to finesse a win. Compared to boss fights in other games similar to Rygar, these were not at all as stimulating and well executed, and were probably the most unimpressive part of the journey to me. I did notice some small glitches throughout the game, and one funny thing that I caught was Rygar appearing as a pile of junk while I was moving into a side-scrolling area from the overworld. Rygar magically appeared intact a moment later, but it was a big enough mess of pixels that I noticed it even though I couldn't pause to take a longer look during my playthrough. The second bit of weirdness was a detail that came about if you died in late game. When our hero hit the dirt, it looked like he got tucked into bed for his eternal slumber because a small rectangle appeared directly on top of him across his body. From what I recall, this didn't happen anywhere else in the game. There are tons of similar visual glitches to enjoy, so if you're into that sort of thing, you'll find lots of non-game breaking stuff here. Rygar is something I think I would have fallen madly in love with if I had played it as a kid. I have a huge soft spot for games like this, and while I wouldn't say it's anything close to easy, it does have a lot going for it to make it approachable for players with a range of skill sets. With its relatively lossless continue system, helpful manual, and clear directives from NPCs, it sets players up for success since many of the problems that plagued early home console titles are missing here. If you can forgive the questionable animal-human fusion experiments and a bit of mediocre music, Rygar's a must-play for adventure game fans.